Nobody would like to encounter some unfamiliar gorilla. Gorillas can be as high as humans if they stand upright, and they are much stronger than us. Our evolutionary pathways have branched fairly recently, so we still look a lot alike. However, while our ancestors invested skill points into brain upgrades, gorillas modified their brain cases to have huge crests for muscle attachment and grew themselves some badass jaws. Gorillas are herbivores, yet their bite force is comparable with that of the biggest predators like lions, bears, hyenas, sharks, and crocodiles. Now imagine gorilla, but 3 or maybe 4 times bigger, and behold, you've got yourself a monster to be terrified of. So, does that monster have any chances to be real? What type of fiction is King Kong? Is it hard or soft science fiction, or maybe it's not science fiction at all? Let's try to find out. Kong's starting position on Sci-Fi Harness tier list is as weak as it gets. He belongs to the primitive gigamorph kaiju strain, which are basically the giant versions of well-known animals. Gigamorphs have the lowest chances to exist among all kaiju, first and foremost because of the square-cube law. If you want to learn more about main kaiju groups or the square-cube law, try my previous video on the general issues of kaiju, but for now, in short, if you scale up bones, they break. If you scale up muscle, it becomes weak. If you scale up nervous system, it becomes retarded. In case of King Kong, square-cube law creates an additional issue. As all the primates, Kong is obviously a mammal, which means he is endothermic, which means he produces his own heat at a near constant rate. Heat production correlates with body volume, while the main heat disposal routes are radiation, convection, and conduction through the skin, which are all proportional to the skin's surface. That means giant creatures, and especially endotherms like mammals, will accumulate much more heat than their smaller counterparts and will risk overheating. One way to solve this problem is to increase body surface without increasing its volume too much, like for example what elephants did with ears. The other way is actually unique to primates. Sweat glands make us lose extra heat through water evaporation. That is what real-life King Kong would probably develop, which means he would need to drink a lot and would be notoriously stinky. All the issues caused by the square-cube law, however, might be not that deadly to the sci-fi hardness of King Kong. Most of his iterations didn't reach the kaiju minimum of 50 meters, and quite a lot were very modestly sized. On his debut in 1933, King Kong was 5.5 meters tall while standing upright on Skull Island, and later he was 7.3 meters in New York. That doesn't actually sound that impossible. Fossil record has evidence of many mammals that grew far larger than the African elephant, as well as many giant primates, the most notable of which is probably Gigantopithecus. The problem with Gigantopithecus is that at the moment we only have its jaw fragments and some teeth, so very much about the creature is yet to be clarified. However, from just those several fossils, we can already learn a lot. For starters, we know that Gigantopithecus belonged to the different branch of the evolutionary tree than humans and gorillas. Its closest living relatives are orangutans. Gigantopithecus inhabited lush forests of what will later become China and Southeast Asia, and went extinct several 100,000 years ago, which is fairly recently in geological terms. Gigantopithecus was huge. Estimates vary, but it is generally accepted that Gigantopithecus was no smaller than 3 meters when stood upright. That means the existence of apes of up to 3 meters tall is not just possible, but is already a proven fact. We have an incident. We can use that fact to set a size limit for a diamond tier, hardcore sci-fi that could theoretically start happening behind our windows at any moment given the right circumstances. Now, I propose we go in 3-meter steps down the tier list, and we get that. Giant apes get fairy tale ridiculous long before they reach kaiju minimum of 50 meters, after crossing the line that not even sauropods probably dared to approach, around 25 meters. So if we judge solely based on the physical constraints of size, the very first King Kong of 1933 stands on a surprisingly solid scientific grounds. Then, in the same year, there was Son of Kong, which was even smaller, just 3.5 meters, almost diamond tier. However, by his very next appearance to fight Godzilla, King Kong has increased up to 45 meters and fell into the cake tier. Then Japanese did Kong with other kaijus once again, and he was a bit more modestly sized this time, enough even to become at least weak science fiction. When he appeared again in America, Kong kinda regained some sci-fi hardness, but demonstrated a slow descent trend, up until Peter Jackson's incarnation in 2005, which brought King Kong to hard sci-fi yet again, with 7.6 meters. However, as of now, that was the last time King Kong was science fiction. In 2017 Skull Island, he almost reaches 32 meters, falling back down into cake tier. Next time we see Kong, he breaks the 100-meter limit, and the last time we saw him, he might have even added a few dozen meters. It seems like for as long as Kong wants to stay in the Monsterverse, he will have to keep up with real kaiju size requirements and stay in cake tier for now. King Kong, while the most famous, is not the only giant fictional primate that we know of. There is, for example, Mighty Joe Young, a gorilla with a rare form of gigantism, which in both of his incarnations stays in Robbie tier with 3.7 and 4.6 meters. There are also lesser-known Japanese kaiju of hominid origin, Sanda and Gaira, 25 and 30 meters tall, both go to cake tier. Out of the recent additions to bestiary, we have George from the Rampage movie, who grows slightly beyond 12 meters and gets into the iron and glass tier. So, we've got a bunch of gigantic monkeys, with dangerously lots of them close to being possible in real life. So what's wrong here? Well, the thing is, the physical size limitations are just a half of the story. The other half is the ecology of giants, which I have discussed in greater detail in my previous video on kaiju. But for now, in short, any giant will need enormous amounts of food to keep functioning, which commonly leads them to spending most of the time feeding. So how does King Kong look from the ecological point of view? What niche exactly does he fill in the ecosystem? Well, both gorillas and Gigantopithecus are herbivores, and to be specific, they are not just any random run-of-the-mill herbivores, but rather specialized ones. They are large forest herbivores that have powerful hands to grab twigs and powerful jaws to chew through the vegetation. We know a bunch of animals that filled similar niche and used similar adaptations, and not even all of them are currently extinct. A living example would be the great panda. Then, until fairly recently, there were giant sloths in South and North Americas. Before them, there were calicotheres, and before those, there were therizinosaurs, which were basically dinosaur versions of gorillas and could reach sizes of up to 10 meters. Dinosaurs had those inbuilt balloons of air sacs and pneumatized bones, so they could grow bigger, but even some extinct mammals of giant forest herbivore group ended up far larger than gorillas and Gigantopithecus, like for example giant sloths. That means evolutionary potential of the oversized apes might be yet still not unfolded to its limits, and they can theoretically grow bigger. From the ecological point of view, the ultimate size ceiling for this niche would be probably limited by the canopy of the forest that a giant inhabits. If a giant can effectively reach even the top branches with the juiciest fruits and leaves, it will have no reason to evolve any taller. If you have long, grabby hands, at least a third of the length can be covered by stretching them up, and hands are also very useful to bend branches, which means we can expect the ultimate giant forest primate to top around the half of the height of the forest he inhabits when standing upright. The average tree height in the Amazon rainforest is 30 meters, so if a giant herbivorous primate happened to have free rein to evolve there, he could have probably stood as high as 15 meters. The problem is, apes only reached Amazon in shape of humans, and the native New World monkeys were not given free rein to evolve into giants. Why do I suddenly speak about Amazon, you might ask? Well, Amazon is kinda the most productive forest on the planet we have for now, which is the optimal environment for a giant ape. In fact, in times when Gigantopithecus lived on Earth, the biggest forested region on the planet was not the Amazon, but Southeast Asia, which back then was not that deep underwater and was called Sundaland. And that is exactly where Gigantopithecus lived. The bigger is the forest, the more there are resources in it. The larger can be the population of giants, as well as the size of the giants. What gorillas have now at their disposal is pathetic, but even before the human deforestation efforts, their range was not that impressive. So what would happen to a giant primate isolated on an island? Skull Island, the homeland of King Kong, is expected to be yet unknown to the explorers as late as in 20th century, which makes it a rather tiny piece of land with an even smaller patch of forests, so yeah. Wait, you might say, but what about island gigantism? Some creatures are known to grow giant when isolated on islands. Well, that is undeniably true, but the devil is in the details. A lot of island gigantism examples we know of are birds, the recently extinct dodo, moa, and Archæoindris, to name a few. Their gigantism, however, comes at the expense of flight. When you don't have to bother with aerodynamics, you can afford to accumulate quite a lot of mass. In terms of air sacs and hollow bones, birds are basically the same as dinosaurs, and if there is no competition for the giant herbivore niches, they can grow big quite fast. The problem is the number of terrestrial species that island can support is significantly lower than on the same area of the nearby mainland. Depending on the size of an island, it can accommodate 1, maybe 2 or 3 species of giant herbivores. And if those niches are already taken, nobody can evolve up there. Birds have the advantage of flight to reach islands among the first. They can get rid of flight ability to grow bigger, and they have natural dinosaur affinity to larger sizes. So no big wonder that most of the big productive islands ended up having their own gigantic and commonly flightless bird species. Another commonly mentioned example of island gigantism are giant tortoises. The most famous ones are of course from the Galapagos, but there are also Aldabra giant tortoises, and until fairly recently there were much more of them. In fact, giant tortoises were once spread all around the world and were a common sight in Africa, Eurasia, Americas, and even Australia. From the continents, they often spread on the nearby islands, since tortoises are good at surviving long periods of starvation, like during a lengthy sea voyage, and a lot of them can float with their head above the water. Unfortunately, being a huge armored creature is one of the worst defensive traits to have against intelligence-based predatory species that can use tools, like humans. And that is probably the main reason why continental giant tortoises went extinct. So what we see on islands nowadays are actually just sad remains of what once was a worldwide spread type of fauna, and not an example of true island gigantism. The same is actually true for Komodo dragon. It is the biggest of the monitor lizards that we have as of today, and at the first glance it looks like an example of island gigantism. However, before humans reached Australia, it was home to Megalania, a continental relative of Komodo dragon that might have been up to 7 meters long and could probably eat Komodo dragons for breakfast. A good example of true island gigantism is coconut crab, which is basically a hermit crab that evolved so big that it didn't need a shell anymore. Coconut crabs can reach up to 1 meter and are the biggest arthropods on land. Being a hermit crab kinda comes with the benefit of arriving on islands early, so they had plenty of time to evolve there even before birds. Okay, you might say, so there are giant birds and giant crabs, but what about the mammals? Do we know any cases of island gigantism among them? As a matter of fact, yes, we do. Small carnivorous and omnivorous mammals that get to the islands often evolve to fill the niche of a top predator, given that there is a productive ecosystem with large herbivores already. That is, for example, fossa, which is basically a giant mongoose. Herbivorous mammals are also known to follow that pattern. If they were small before they arrived on the island, and the bigger size niches were vacant, they can grow to fill them. There are many giant rodent species known from islands around the world, as well as there is a recently extinct giant island rabbit, Neuralagus. Okay, you might say, giant rabbits are fun, but stop tiptoeing around the subject already and finally tell us, do the giant vegan mammals grow bigger on islands or not? Well, let's talk a bit about island dwarfism. While island giants are usually overgrown invaders from the mainland, island dwarfs are often survivors of an ancient indigenous ecosystem. A part of the mainland, for some reason, can become an island, making resources of the ecosystem much more limited. Populations of large-sized animals might not survive such a shock, but some adapt to decrease their calorie needs by getting smaller. That is basically what happens with all large mammalian herbivores on islands. There are no less than a dozen of species of recently extinct tiny elephants and mammoths scattered around the islands all over the world. There have also been tiny ground sloths, tiny hippos, and a lot of other adorable tiny megafauna, most of which was regrettably hunted to extinction upon contact with humans. Tiny deer and bovids are found around the islands of the world to this day. There was also human species that got smaller on island, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits. We actually even have a very good paleontological example of how a giant herbivorous primate would evolve on the island if it could take a top niche there. I am speaking about the Archæoindris, extinct around 23 centuries ago. It was a close relative of modern Indri and Sifaka lemurs, and it was the biggest lemur to ever walk the earth. It had a size comparable to modern-day gorilla. And it didn't live on just any random island. Madagascar is the fourth biggest island on Earth. It is very productive in terms of ecology, and it is actually comparable to a small continent in terms of biogeography. Natural resources at the disposal of Archæoindris were vast. They had little to none natural predators, and their competition was limited by island hippos, elephant birds, lost of the giant tortoises, and weird beasts known as koala lemurs, while gorillas and chimps had to stand against all the African predators, megafauna, and us, humans. The end result is, even on the enormous island with little competition, giant herbivorous primates do not outgrow their continental counterparts. The final nail to the coffin of a giant island ape is its relationship with humans. In almost all the King Kong iterations, it gets worshipped by the islanders, while in reality, Archæoindris, koala lemurs, dodos, elephant birds, tiny elephants, giant turtles, and many other large-sized island herbivores went extinct very soon after first contact with our species. That means, in essence, that any gorilla species found on an island after a significant period of isolation will decrease in size to at least some degree, and if it becomes bigger instead, or God forbid gets worshipped by humans, into the cake tier it goes. That is basically what we see in the original movie, and all the following movies, up to 2017 Kong School Island. Later, it turns out that Monsterverse Kong actually originates from the interior of Hollow Earth, which is even less likely origin story than growing huge on an island. The only thing that somewhat redeems Kong's size here is his carnivorous diet, but the whole concept of the existence of Hollow Earth, inhabited by enigmatic megafauna, is deep beyond the cake tier. The entire explanation of why it is so would take a separate video, so I won't go deep into it here, but if you are interested in seeing such a video on Hardcore Sci-Fi channel, let me know in the comments. So yeah, sorry guys, but from the ecology and evolution point of view, none of the Kongs make sense. Realistically speaking, island isolation would leave gorilla size intact at best, but the most probable outcome for them would be to shrink. So what we will really meet on a hypothetical Skull Island is not a King Kong, but a population of mini Kongs, and I'm not speaking about the recent movie, rather they probably wouldn't be bigger than medium-sized dogs or even average-sized cats. So yeah. But maybe it's just King Kong? Let's check out how the other giant monkey movies are doing in terms of origins, shall we? Japanese almost kaiju Sanda and Gaira are actually spawn of the kaiju Frankenstein, who grew to the immense sizes because of some magic mechanical heart implanted into some boy, and into the cake tier they go as well. Mighty Joe Young does surprisingly well here, however. He's just a gorilla afflicted with gigantism, which is not that impossible given that we see that in humans. He comes from the African jungle, and he is almost diamond tier possible. However, I doubted that he would be exactly mighty. Given his sickness, he would probably be weak and sluggish, since his body tissues and organs are not generally adapted for such size. I will leave it in the rubby tier of serious sci-fi and move on to the last giant movie ape, George from Rampage. We deal with some sort of unobtainium here, a mutation variety. It afflicts multiple species, it works surprisingly fast, it has some miraculous side effects and almost no negative ones, so the best I can say about it is probably rubber tier, weak sci-fi. Now, if we count together the averages from size ratings and origin story ratings, we can get a general overview of science fiction hardness of King Kongs and other giant apes. It appears if you seek a truly realistic one, the best choice might be Mighty Joe Young. The most realistic of King Kongs are the original one, his son, and the Peter Jackson's iteration, but even those can rate as high as mediocre sci-fi at best. In the same tier, we have George from Rampage, and in the weak science fiction and science fantasy, we have a couple of movies from 60s to 80s. Almost every time King Kong shares a screen or a franchise with Godzilla, he ends up being cake tier fairy tale ridiculous. I'm sorry to bring up these news, guys, but it seems like being kaiju big is just not for everyone, if we speak serious science. That, however, doesn't mean that Godzilla herself is a cake tier. Study of Godzilla is a topic of a separate video, which I will do sometime soon, as well as I plan to do some videos on other kaiju. If you have good ideas, please leave them in the comments. So, thanks for watching, and if you wanna see more content like that, subscribe! It is scientifically proven to work. Stay hardcore, and see ya in the next video!